For one reason or another, from leaders of nations to military generals, scholars, religious figures, and even explorers. Of the latter category, many from the West may first think of famous explorers like Marco Polo or Christopher Columbus. But Europe wasn't the only continent to birth such renowned adventurers. One particularly prominent explorer from outside of the West was Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was a man of Berber descent born in Tangier under the reign of the Marinid dynasty in February of 1304. His family was made up of Islamic legal scholars who belonged to the Lawata Berber tribe. Ibn Battuta himself would likely have studied at a Sunni Maliki school and was offered a job as a religious judge, but he would soon realize that his heart yearned for much, much more. At the age of 21, our protagonist decided that he was going to leave his typical life in Morocco and set off for a pilgrimage to Mecca. This trip would usually take roughly 16 months to complete, but Ibn Battuta would not return to his hometown for 24 years. I set out alone, having neither fellow traveler in whose companionship I might find cheer, nor caravan whose part I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me and a desire long cherished in my bosom to visit these illustrious sanctuaries. So I braced my resolution to quit my dear ones, female and male, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nests. My parents being yet in the bonds of life, it weighed sorely upon me to part from them, and both they and I were afflicted with sorrow at this separation. As he describes in his own words, Ibn Battuta began his journey entirely solo, during which he first traveled by land across the North African coast, passing through Tlemcen, Beaya, and Tunis. Here in Tunis, he stopped for a couple of months before continuing on his voyage. He eventually arrived at the port of Alexandria in the spring of 1326, where it says he met two notable men who would further fuel the fires of his traveler's desires. One of these men, Sheikh Morshidi, is said to have interpreted the meaning of one of Ibn Battuta's dreams, confirming that he was meant to be a world traveler. The other, Sheikh Burhanuddin, who was believed to have predicted Ibn Battuta's destiny as a world traveler as well, even telling him, "You must visit my brother Fariduddin in India, Rukn-uddin in Sind, and Burhanuddin in China. Convey my greetings to them." Ibn Battuta eventually did some exploring around the Alexandria area and then headed off for Cairo, where he remained for a month and at some point met a man who warned him that he would only be able to arrive in Mecca if he traveled through Syria. After leaving Cairo, which was the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, Ibn Battuta continued his adventure, though he had first remained within other Mamluk territories. Next, hoping to continue on toward Mecca, he traveled up the Nile Valley and eventually to the port of Aydab. Showing up in the wrong place at the wrong time, though, Ibn Battuta was forced to turn back to Cairo after running into a local revolt that prevented his journey further toward Mecca. Recalling the message relayed to him by the mysterious man he met on his first Cairo trip, Ibn Battuta then headed to Damascus, stopping in Hebron, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem along the way. Once in Damascus, he decided to stay for the entirety of Ramadan before moving along to Medina, which was another important Islamic site. 4 days later, Ibn Battuta would finally make his way to Mecca. Here, with the long-awaited completion of the young man's first pilgrimage, Ibn Battuta was given the honorific title of Haji. With his first significant goal achieved, many believed that he would now return home to Morocco, but this would not be the case for quite a while longer. Instead of going home as 1326 neared its close, Ibn Battuta opted to join a caravan of fellow pilgrims on a trip elsewhere. They first passed through Najaf, where Ibn Battuta visited the mausoleum of Ali, and from there decided to part ways with the caravan of Ali and turn to Baghdad. He instead voyaged next to Wasit, then along the Tigris River to reach Basra, eventually into Iran, where he stopped at the town of Isfahan. From there, he reached Shiraz and eventually did end up in Baghdad, but not until the early summer of 1327. Once he arrived in Baghdad, though, the traveler ran into a pretty important person. Abu Sa'id, the final Mongol leader of the unified Ilkhanate, was fleeing for the north when Ibn Battuta ran into him and decided to accompany him on his journey, an offer that he just couldn't pass up. But at some point along the way, as he'd done with the prior caravan, Ibn Battuta parted from the royal retinue and journeyed along the Silk Road until he reached Tabriz. He would soon become the guest of yet another prominent figure, this time when he traveled to Mosul, where he was invited to meet with the Ilkhanate governor. From there, Ibn Battuta left for Caesarea and Mardin, then Sinjar, before heading back to Mosul to once more join another caravan of pilgrims. The timeline of the next leg of his journey is slightly disputed, but Ibn Battuta eventually made his way back to Mecca in 1327 and likely stayed until either 1328 or 1330. Over the next year or so, he found himself at the port of Jeddah, from which he journeyed along the Red Sea coast until he stepped foot in Yemen, next exploring some of its important cities and even meeting the Mujahid Nur al-Din Ali, the ruler of the Rasulid dynasty. After this, Ibn Battuta likely arrived in either Sana'a or Aden, then took a ship from Aden to Zila. After a week in the latter, he moved on to Cape Gard Afui, where he stayed an additional 7 days. By 1332, he would arrive in Mogadishu, where he stayed for a bit before voyaging on to Mombasa and the Swahili coast. Then he traveled to Kilwa, back to Oman, followed by the Strait of Hormuz, and yet again back to Mecca. And as though he had not already traveled more than many ever would in their entire lives, Ibn Battuta was still far from done. His next stretch of adventure took him across the Red Sea and up the Nile Valley toward Cairo again, from which he journeyed to Palestine and eventually to the port of Latakia. From there, he went by ship to Alanya, then by land to Agadir, where he spent that year's Ramadan. After its end, there's a period of Ibn Battuta's travels that are a bit tricky to understand and were possibly told out of order, but according to the man himself, he left Agadir from Malis, then made his way to Konya, eventually ending up in Erzurum, and finally to Birgi. This seems a bit jumbled and out of order, but it is the path that Ibn Battuta says he took. Over the next leg of his journey, he visited Iznik, Bursa, the Beylik of Aden, Ephesus, Izmir, Balıkesir. Finally, departing from Anatolia through Sinop, Ibn Battuta went by sea to the Golden Horde and eventually the port of Azov. From Azov, he made his way to Majar, Mount Beshtau, Bulgar, and eventually Astrakhan. Then he somehow convinced Özbek Khan, who he had been with at this time, to allow him to accompany Princess Bayalun, Khan's pregnant wife, back to Constantinople, where she would give birth. Upon their arrival, Ibn Battuta was able to meet Emperor Andronicus III of Byzantium before visiting the Hagia Sophia and opting to stay in the city for a full month. Once he was ready to leave Constantinople, Ibn Battuta set his sights on Sarai al-Jadid, Bukhara, and Samarkand, where he would meet yet another Mongol ruler in the latter before heading off now for Afghanistan along his way to India. Delhi would hold his first significant Indian adventure as he met the remarkably wealthy Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. The Sultan quickly took a liking to Ibn Battuta, and the now seasoned explorer was given the job of Qadi, essentially a judge in Delhi. While this was a great honor, it was a bit difficult for Ibn Battuta to do from his position to enforce Islamic law in India outside of Delhi. Eventually, the adventurer would continue his journey into the rest of India nonetheless, although it appeared that his position in Delhi wouldn't help him much outside of the Sultan's court. At some point while in India, Ibn Battuta was kidnapped by a group of Hindu rebels and robbed. Luckily, he would eventually be freed to return to his travels, at which point he made way to modern-day Pakistan, where he visited the shrine of Baba Farid, and then found his way to Jhansi and Sindh. After completing the exploration of India, the traveler wanted to leave for another pilgrimage to Mecca, but the Sultan of Delhi had other plans for his new judge. It wasn't until 1341 that Ibn Battuta would be allowed to leave, only because he was tasked with joining a Chinese ambassador that was hoping to rebuild a Himalayan Buddhist temple. While traveling with the ambassador, he was once again kidnapped and robbed and now separated from his fellow travelers. Nevertheless, the experienced adventurer would catch up with the others in less than 2 weeks later, from which point they would make their way to Camcott and then Calcutta, where he would yet again become the guest of a local monarch. Once he was ready to leave Calcutta, Ibn Battuta faced even more bad luck, as one of the ships he and his group had taken to reach the city had been destroyed by a storm, while the other was taken by some of his companions without him on board. At this point, he was determined not to return to Delhi, although he was essentially stuck in southern India as he sought the protection of the contemporary Sultan of Nawayat. But when the Sultan and his sultanate as a whole ultimately collapsed, the traveler now had to leave India altogether, and he eventually found himself in the Maldives Islands for the next 9 months after being convinced by the local leadership to become their chief